Yeah.
Your background. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to mute you, Keith, because we're going to get started. There we go. Got it. Okay. Thank you for everybody for tuning in. My name is Mark Spatafor. I'm president of the Greater Syracuse Labor Council, AFL-CIO, and I'm going to welcome you to a very special event that we have here today. We have an internationally renowned activist and author, Bill Fletcher. But before we get to Bill, I do want to give a special thank you to the Central New York chapter of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, CBTU. They canceled their meeting tonight for Bill to hear his message, and I'm really grateful for them to do that. Also, I also want to thank the Mid-State Central Labor Council in Cortland and Ithaca. Really thank you. They also canceled their meeting tonight to be here. Thank you, brothers and sisters. I am so glad that we can put this message out there, because I've said this once, I've said it a million times. Labor's message does not get out there. There are no more labor reporters at the newspapers or out there. We have to get our message out. And that's one of the reasons why we have this talk by again, an internationally renowned. We're so lucky to have him here tonight. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to my brother, Bill Fletcher. Bill.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I wanted to express my appreciation to the Greater Syracuse Central Labor Council, to the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and the Mid-State Central Labor Council for this evening. And I've been looking forward to this. And what I am going to do is lay out some thoughts. And then what I'm most interested in is an exchange with you. And so questions, comments that you might have, that would be great. Because the source of all wisdom does not come from yours truly. It comes from the discussion that we'll have. So I'm very excited about that. But let me try to, well, when Mark asked me to give this presentation, he said, where does labor need to go? Now, that may sound like very specific directions, but there's any number of ways to take that question and travel. And I worked on this for a while, trying to think of, well, what should be the real focus? So I want to begin by speaking first about the moment that we're in. It's a moment of turbulence and uncertainty. We are living through a massive war in which over the last 2 years, more than 760,000 people have died. And when I'm talking about a war, I think that's the way we need to understand the pandemic. This is a war. It's a war unlike anything that any of us have seen. The last time that the United States was afflicted by something like this was 100 years ago. And I'm not including World War II. But 100 years ago with the great pandemic of 1918 through about 1920. But the deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic exceed the deaths from the great influenza of 1918, 1919. And when you think about 760,000 people have died, 52,000 US troops died in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, over several years. In 2 years, less than 2 years, we've lost 760,000 people. This is a moment also of irrationality, where you have a football player who suggested it's better to take animal pills than to take the vaccine. We have people that are denying climate change, despite the extreme weather events we're seeing, destroying islands like Puerto Rico, rising waters that are facing a number of islands, very, very strange summers and winters that we've been experiencing, the climate attacks on the Gulf Coast. But we have people that deny it. In fact, a former president of ours claimed that there was no climate change. There was no environmental disaster. We have people that are suggesting that we're living in a moment which they describe as a moment of white genocide or white replacement. I mean, just think about that, the Charlottesville March from 2017, and the chants that were being articulated by the fascists who were marching. And there were two chants: they will not replace us, and Jews will not replace us. And it's like, wow, replace who? What exactly is going on here? But this mythology has been encouraged by various forces around the country, leading many white people, particularly white working people whose lives are collapsing, not because of Jews, not because of people of color, not because of Muslims, but because this economy is squeezing working people and destroying what's left of the American dream. And the rich keep getting richer, playing off all of those of us at the bottom. And then we have right now inflation, largely driven by what was in effect a minor depression. And by minor, I don't mean that it was insignificant. I mean, it wasn't like the Great Depression, but it was a hell of a lot more than a recession. And people were losing everything. And in that, as the economy has been rebuilding, we're having this challenge of inflation. And the focus ends up being on Biden, as opposed to understanding the failure of the country to prepare for the possibility of a pandemic and what it could mean economically, not to mention what it could mean for the lives of millions of people. In that context, is it enough for the trade union movement to do what it has generally done? Is it enough for us to be focused on wages, hours, and working conditions? Is this the sum total of what concerns workers, even at work? I would say not. I don't think it ever has been. You know, think about the issues that could concern your members, that concern yourselves: housing, education, debt, student debt. You want to send your kid to college. What about healthcare? What about the future of this planet? Yet we have in our trade union movement leaders who are narrowly focused on the issues of wages, hours, and working conditions and not thinking about the future. I got into the trade union movement as a welder in a shipyard, the Quincy shipyard in Massachusetts. And during the mid to late 1970s, we were building liquefied natural gas tankers. When a contract ran out, the company started laying people off. In that moment, the leadership of the union, the Industrial Union of Marine and Shipbuilding Workers of America, which is now part of the machinists, started looking around for work that could be brought to the shipyard. There were some very visionary workers in the shipyard that said, let's not think in old terms. It's not that we have to be thinking beyond the building of military craft or the repairing of broken down ships. We've got to be thinking bigger. So they did some research and they found that in Europe, there were shipyards that were building ships that created electrical power through thermals in the ocean. So we're actually talking about green energy, even before the term was used. And they brought this before the union. And the union leadership thought that this was such a ridiculous idea, because why would a shipyard in the United States create such ships? Why, and was it really the role of the union to advance such ideas? And it was at that moment that it became clear that we had people in the Jurassic era running our movement, people that were not understanding that we were in very different times and needing a very different kind of union leadership. Well, of course, the shipyard closed. It no longer exists. The union ceased to exist. And that was one of the early things for me that pointed out that we need a different kind of leadership. But there's also something else that says to me that we need a different sort of union leadership. And that is that we're facing a very, very dangerous political moment. We have an authoritarian movement that challenged the 2020 elections and on January 6th threatened a coup. which we all saw. And now, and this is one of those things that it's like, you can't make this stuff up. They're trying to tell us that we actually didn't see a coup that was being played out, that it was just honest to goodness Americans expressing their point of view, despite the fact that those honest to goodness Americans were yelling to kill Vice President Pence. Well, we're not supposed to see that. This same movement is threatening election officials. I don't mean elected officials, people that run elections around the country, and insisting that people that were trying to oversee an honest to goodness election were wrong in not identifying that Trump should have been the person that won the election. And we all have movements that are sweeping our school committees and school boards, demanding that the history of the United States be distorted in a way that doesn't address the actual history of the United States, the history of struggle, the history of accomplishments, as well as the history of atrocities. And we have in our leadership, unfortunately, too many people that have put their heads in the sand. A few months ago, I went to a number of union leaders, top union leaders, with a proposal. I'm not going to name names, but I went to them with a proposal for a different approach to leadership development. And I suggested that the union movement needs its own version of West Point or the War College, that it needs to start training our upcoming generals and colonels in our movement on strategy, tactics, building campaigns, understanding your opponents, the whole 9 yards. So I presented this to these leaders. When I was finished with my presentation, they said, well, that's interesting, Bill, but, we usually take care of that ourselves, or we send people to the Harvard Trade Union program, or there's a number of universities that have education programs and things like that. And I said, yeah, no, I know. They said, well, but your proposal is kind of redundant. I said, okay, I hear you. I said, but let me ask you a question. How many of those leadership programs prepared your leaders for what the union movement should have done had the January 6th coup attempt succeeded? What should we have done had they grabbed Pence and lynched him and overturned the election, and perhaps Trump declaring a national emergency? What should the union movement have done? Silence. As people say these days, crickets. No response. They just stared. I was just doing this virtually, and they stared at their cameras. Not one word. Then I further asked, I said, now, we can't assume that this ultra right wing element is going away. We have to assume that there's going to be disruptions in Congress and legislatures. There'll probably be various forms of terrorism. Did those leadership development programs, did they prepare your leaders for that? Silence. Not a word. A couple of chuckles. And that's it. And this moment, it just said to me, wow, people are living in a level of denial. We're in a major crisis. And we have union leaders that want to pretend this is 1970. So what are the implications? Here are a few thoughts. First and foremost, we have to recognize that we are right now in a battle for democracy. It's something that someone called, and I've repeated, we're in a cold civil war. We're in a moment when there are actually elements that would like to make it a hot civil war. But right now, there is this incredible polarization, and there's an attempt to unravel democracy, to challenge truth, to challenge science, to challenge actual statistics, and to undermine the right to vote. So we have a challenge in front of us to fight for the right of workers to organize unions, the right to strike, which is largely evaporated, voting rights, the right for people to vote, to be unencumbered, to not fear that when they go into the voting place that they will be challenged or harassed, but also to expand and make it easier for people to vote. Why should it be so difficult? What is it about this country that we try to make the actual act of voting such a challenge? It's like competing for the Olympics, as opposed to the idea that we should be encouraging people to be involved in a democracy. A second thing, we need an economy that works for our people, and particularly for working people. The president's proposal of Build Back Better is absolutely what we need. The infrastructure bill that was just passed. This country is falling apart. Everybody knows this. I tell people all the time that when I'm driving down highways, I do the Lord's Prayer when I cross every bridge and go through tunnels. When I drove my daughter to college a number of years ago, she went to the University of Miami, and I'm up in Maryland, and I drove through South Carolina. Oh my God. I mean, looking at the roads, it looked like somebody had driven down the road throwing hand grenades out the window. I mean, I had to keep dodging holes and kept wondering, looking at swamps that seemed to be encroaching and wondering, like, am I going to make it to Miami? Do I need pontoons? I mean, when we look at this, what's been happening, we know that there's dramatic changes that need to take place. I mean, the infrastructure bill should have passed Congress unanimously. How could you have elected officials that would oppose that? How do you have elected officials that don't understand that we need to put resources into childcare? Part of what happened when the pandemic hit us is that masses of workers, particularly women, had to abandon the workplace. Why? Because childcare collapsed. And there was nothing, there was no net to protect anybody. Why does this country make it so difficult for women to work? Why does it make it so difficult for families? Let me tell you a story, something that really struck me. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, it was mainly men that worked in like factories. And as a result of the war, men were being enlisted into the military and sent off to the fronts. So they needed more workers in the points of production. So they started bringing in women. Well, the women that were coming in needed childcare. Excuse me. So what happened? Were there massive studies to determine whether childcare could happen? Did it take years to try to establish this? No. Let me break it to you. Within a matter of weeks, if not months, childcare facilities were established in workplaces around this country. There were no major studies. All of a sudden, it was done. Why was it done? Because it was absolutely necessary. Why isn't it that we lack childcare facilities in our workplaces? Why is childcare treated as if it's the same thing as watching someone's kid, as babysitting? Well, Congress should be addressing this. And the labor movement needs to be pushing this and pushing it hard. A third thing, you can't work if you can't breathe, and you can't work if you can't drink the water. I mean, look, the environment is an issue that labor should be advancing. And that means that we need to be right there in the middle of the discussion about what's called a just transition. We need to be making sure that employment is coming to people who are going to lose it, or that the proper training is made available, or the proper compensation. Again, I said I was a shipyard worker. There was an act, I don't even know whether it's still on the books, called the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, which was directed at workers that were losing their jobs because of foreign competition. As a shipyard worker in 1980, as the layoffs were happening, we became eligible for the TAA. And what did that mean? It meant extended unemployment benefits. It meant entering into training programs, real training programs. You could apply and learn things like computers, electronics, et cetera. I don't mean train to flip hamburgers, but real honest to goodness work. Why do we not have an extension of that to cover all workers that are affected as a result of the environmental catastrophe that we're living in? That should be what we as a movement are pushing. Fourth, we need fairness and equity throughout the society. We need to end the practices that pit different segments of the working class against one another. We need to repair the damages from centuries of racism, settlerism, and sexism. And if you don't believe that we should be paying attention or that these issues are all in the past, then I would challenge you. If you think that we're on a level playing field, then let's prove it. Let's abolish inheritance. And then let's see what happens. If you think that we're on a level playing field, let's get rid of inheritance and start everybody off in the same place. And since I know that that is not going to go over very well, then I would say that that tells you something about the history of the country and about the inequalities that are built in that we as a movement must confront. Fifth, we talk about solidarity forever, but our movement is pretty funny when it comes to people on other sides of the border. We really lack real internationalism unless what it is going on a trip somewhere. So we need to start thinking not just about trade agreements and how they're affecting us in the United States. We need to think about the relationship of the United States to the rest of the planet. One of the things that a lot of people overlooked about NAFTA, when the debate about NAFTA was going on, very few people pointed out or raised the question of, well, what's going to happen to the Mexican workers as a result of NAFTA? And in the aftermath of the passing of NAFTA, there's some interesting things that happened. One is that in Mexico, the agricultural sector largely collapsed, as did much of the public sector. So immediately there was a mass migration of people from rural areas of Mexico into the cities. But since there was a lack of work, people then started migrating north to the United States. NAFTA had this effect on Mexico before it had the devastating impact that on us in the United States. Before NAFTA, there was the US-Canadian Free Trade Agreement. And guess what happened? The Canadians lost jobs to low-wage workers in, hold on to your hat, Ohio and Indiana. Jobs left Ontario and went to the United States. Workers are getting screwed by capitalism. Let's put it right there on the table. It's not that they're getting screwed by Canadian workers or screwed by Mexican workers or Filipinos or Chinese workers. They're getting screwed by capitalism. When is our movement going to say that? When is our movement going to say, let us figure out ways of joining hands concretely with workers in other parts of the world that are going up against the same multinational corporations and against the governments that are supporting them? When are we going to say that? When do we move the blame away from the workers from the Dominican Republic or from Haiti or from Venezuela and start talking about the corporations that are playing us like the strings on a violin? I want to wrap up by suggesting that central to this entire discussion is something that we in the trade union movement very rarely do, which is to talk about US history. And right now there's a debate going on about US history. It's being advanced by people on the extreme right, and it's an attack on what they call critical race theory. Now, what's so funny about this is that most of the people that are attacking critical race theory know less about that than I know about what's on the other side of the moon. They have no idea. They use the term without knowing what it is, which came out of law schools and a discussion about the long-term impact of racism, right? That's what it is. But they use that term as a way to suggest that our school system should not be teaching our children the truth about the history of the United States. That we should be painting a picture that makes everybody feel good because nothing was ever done wrong in the United States. Slavery was not really that bad. We didn't really seize northern Mexico. We didn't really create a coup in Hawaii and grab Hawaii. We didn't really push the Native Americans off their land. We traded for beads. None of that. And actually going further, that this is not a country that's had struggle of workers for justice. It's been a country of entrepreneurs, rugged individualism. Everybody gets what they get because they work hard. So in other words, we're being asked to believe nonsense. And so the question is, within our own ranks of the trade union movement, do we speak the truth? And do we insist that our school systems and government teach the truth? And further, do we insist that they encourage debate? I'm not expecting that everyone's going to necessarily agree with my view on US history, so let's have a debate. But a debate necessitates the facts. And the facts are not like whatever I happen to be thinking. The facts are things that people dig up and they research. So why shouldn't our movement be advancing such an approach? This means, my friends, that we need a different kind of movement. It means that many of our leaders need to retire, that the time is really gone. I remember one of my favorite movies is Patton with George C. Scott. And if you haven't ever seen it, I strongly recommend it. It's a fascinating story. Scott is brilliant, just channels Patton. But it's a brilliant look at different kinds of leadership, the strengths and weaknesses. But in the very beginning of the movie, the US had suffered this humiliating defeat at the hands of the Nazis at a battle called Kasserine Pass, which is in Tunisia. And Patton is brought in to take over the II Corps, which is the US troops there, and reorganize them. And they dismissed the general who was leading the II Corps because he was incompetent. He was completely incompetent. He was probably a nice guy, but he wasn't up to the task that was necessary at the moment. Our movement needs its own patents. It needs to recognize that many of our leaders are for another time. We need people that are thinking differently and understanding the nature of the opponents that we're up against. And as they say, and I repeat all the time, failure is not an option. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And actually, we do have a comment in the chat from your nephew, Peter DeJesus, my brother from the Western New York Area Labor Federation. He says, don't forget about what we did to Puerto Rico. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I absolutely do. And Peter, forgive me for not mentioning Puerto Rico. But you're absolutely right. The United States seized Puerto Rico, Guam, turned Cuba into a neo-colony as a result of the Spanish-American War, which was a war that should never have been fought. It grabbed the Philippines. And it's very important because in grabbing the Philippines, by the way, the United States fought a 10-year war with the Filipino people who were on the verge of winning independence and killed somewhere between 1 and 2 million Filipinos in what historians describe as a genocidal war. And Puerto Rico has never had the opportunity to choose its own future. And Peter, thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Pete. And so we do have a question from our Facebook Live from a steelworker retiree, Ray Trudell, who asks, we talk about freedom, but we fear freedom and equality because we're feared that we will lose more. How can we show that that is not true?
It's an interesting question. I think I'm going to answer it this way. We can convince people of a different path by winning important victories that can be demonstrated to others as to what the implication of unity, solidarity, etc., what the implication is. People who have been oppressed, including slaves, there were many slaves that refused to leave the plantations. Even when they found out that Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, hundreds of thousands did, which is a major contributing factor to the North winning the Civil War. But there were many that refused to move. They were so used to being imprisoned by slavery that they feared the consequences. So my general rule of thumb is this. I'll use a metaphor in terms of what I think we need to be doing. The Poseidon Adventure. I don't know how many of you ever saw the film, either the original one with Gene Hackman or the remake. But for those of you that never saw it, the idea is that there was a cruise ship, it's fictional, cruise ship that hit by something that's called a rogue wave, which I used to think was imaginary, but they actually exist. This huge wave, usually created by an earthquake. And the ship capsizes. So a lot of people are killed immediately, but there's a lot of people that are in the banquet area because there's a party going on. Gene Hackman, who's always brilliant, is a major star in this. And he looks around and he realizes that in order to have the possibility of survival, they need to get to what used to be the bottom of the ship, because the ship is now upside down, because that's where, if help comes, it will most likely come. So he says to all these people, there's a Christmas tree, big Christmas tree. Let's start climbing out of here and head to what used to be the bottom. Well, there's a person there who's injured, who says, no, we should stay here and wait for the captain to give us our instructions. Hackman says, the captain is probably dead. We can't wait here, we will drown. The person says, no, let's wait. Most of the people decide to wait. The important people, like Shelley Winters, Red Buttons, Gene Hackman, and others, they decide to climb the tree. So when those stars get to the top and they're getting ready to exit, all of a sudden the water starts rushing in. And all these people that have been waiting to be saved panic, run for the tree, try to climb it, the tree collapses, they all die. My point, we got to climb the tree. There are some people that simply, no matter what we say, they're not going to climb. They're not going to move. They relish what they believe to be safety. There comes a certain point when the discussion is over, whether it's in the trade union movement or other movements, the people that are prepared to move are going to have to move forward, because otherwise you court disaster.
So actually, Keith, you want to come off of mute and ask your question?
Yes. How you doing?
Good.
Good. So I like what you were speaking upon, the old scenario of old leadership, how it's in a nutshell ruined the union, and I totally agree with that. Old time thinking, nepotism is far, in my opinion, and witness, ruining and running the union as well. I think, in my opinion, that the union would become stronger if the membership reflects this leadership. The leadership reflects its members. Unfortunately, that's not happening. Union density is at an all-time low because of the thinking of the past. There is no more It's a lot of manufacturing sector has dwindled. So more women are becoming the breadwinners. Minorities are far more than the typical white male or your male counterpart to join the union. Unfortunately, the union, in my opinion, has taken the role of the employer. if you look at it, the employer never wants to give up the power. They'll do anything they can to keep the worker at its lowest point. And from what I'm seeing for the last, I would say going on 13 to 15 years of being a union activist, I'm seeing this more often. I'll just specifically talk about my union. They send you to these leadership class, but the people that go to these leadership class never have the opportunity to get in leadership positions because of the nepotism and the favoritism and the politics of the good old boy thinking. Unfortunately, what is the answer to change that? I do not know, because when you do have these elections, most of your counterparts, the white male counterparts that run for office, it's being spread all across your locals. And most of your membership, at least in where I'm at, don't even know who the international representatives are running. So they tend to fall in line based on the local leadership endorsements. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, you build the union from the bottom up. Unfortunately, I have to, in a sense, you can agree with that, but when it comes to the local level, if most of your membership is primarily white male, how do you change that within?
So Keith, let me, just in the interest of time, I appreciate what you're raising. Let me try to respond to what you're raising, so we have some time for some other comments. So I think you're raising an incredibly important set of issues. And so one is that I agree with you that the leadership of our movement absolutely needs to reflect much more than it does the membership. There's no question about that. And the way that that's going to happen is by organizing our memberships. There really isn't, there is not an easy answer to that. We've got to activate our members so that they look at the union as an important place for them to be engaged. And there are many of our members that are in fact there, but there are also many of our members that feel like the union is largely irrelevant except at contract time. And so that necessitates a few things. It necessitates a particular role that the leadership needs to play of transforming the union into an institution that is one that's fighting for justice and one that actually engages the members. There was a documentary I saw years ago that really struck me. It was about the Merchant Marines and during World War II. And one of the things that they said almost in passing is that all of these ships were unionized. This is during the war. They're all unionized. And on those ships, there were union councils that ran the union. It wasn't staff people. Those ships didn't have, like they didn't have a business agent or a union rep on the ships. They had a council made up of the members that ran the union. And I talked to a veteran of the Merchant Marine who had been in the National Maritime Union, very iconic figure named Jack Odell. And I asked him about it. I said, is this true? He said, absolutely. And he said, and the leadership of the union in New York would basically say, y'all need to resolve the problems while you're out on the ships and not come back to New York or wherever, whatever port, and bring the problems. It's a completely different way of thinking about the role of the union. Whereas now what we often have is an over-reliance on the rep and making the reps, in effect, de facto paralegals, rather than the reps being internal organizers. So I think that there's a role for leadership in transforming the relationship of the membership, but also unions are political organizations. And people that feel as you do, Keith, I think part of what you have to do, which is something that I had to do, was organize members to try to change what the leadership looked like. And that meant building coalitions within the union.
Okay, Anne-Marie and then Pete. Anne-Marie, are you there? If not,
Can you hear me?
yep, we hear you
Yes,
now.
we can hear
Thank
you
you.
now.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
No.
yes, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. But I always have that argument with my husband, who was a Teamster and believes Teamsters do really difficult work and waitresses don't. And it's kind of like when you said that before, you know, I know you would support my union, but you have to be careful, because when you say like flipping a burger, it's not true. And I laugh because after coming through COVID, when we are nothing but a service society, I don't think flipping a hamburger becomes even more important. But the problem with my workers, my industry is, you know, my union was one of those unions that never did their organizing, and they came first, and it kind of leads into what you said about leadership. I'm not, you know, disputing what you said about leadership, except youth is not necessarily the answer either. It's the kind of person, it's our culture. You know, now leadership comes up through politics within the union. They really, a lot of leaders never truly held the job long enough to understand what working in that industry is like. So I think I agree with you that we need new leadership, but I think it's a far more complex issue than just changing sex or color or age. I think it's about the culture. I was privileged
Yes.
to know people who did create the unions, and it's just a different, you know, it's a different cult. It's coming from a different point.
Yes.
So it's just, but the comment about the flipping of the hamburgers, you got to be careful what you say.
No, you're absolutely right. You caught me. I'm not going to fight you. I agree 100%.
I know you wouldn't. I know
Yeah.
you wouldn't, but
Yeah.
we end up saying things. I'm sure I say things too, but
Yeah.
you know, we have to be careful how we speak, because in this culture, all of us are worthless, right?
That's right. That's right.
What do we see every day on TV? You know, the person that does nothing and makes a lot of money, whether he's a drug dealer or she's a drug dealer or a highfalutin financier, right? So
Yeah.
it's a whole, I watched the old movies from the 30s and the 40s, and I remember what a union culture is all about, right?
Yeah.
They talk about unions in those movies.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. I agree 100%. And your second point, I think, is also so important, that it's not just about shifting people and putting in, whether younger people or other demographics, but it is about politics with a small p. In other words, vision. What is the vision? But there is one thing I do want to say about youth, which is that we have a movement that is, I think, very hostile to young people, and that we have this attitude. And I say this when I do a lot of trainings. I say, if you want to make sure that young people don't ever come back to your organization, all you have to say is the following: that's not the way we do it here. Usually you say that and that's it. And you're almost guaranteed. I've almost wanted to patent that, right? If you want to cleanse the room of young people, that's actually all you have to do. And they'll leave. And unfortunately, we have a movement that in one way or another does that repeatedly and says to younger people, that's not the way we do it here. Now, I don't mean by that the way that young people, depending on how you define young, do things is always better. It's going to be different. And it's important for older people, veteran activists, to respect the contributions that young people are already making. But when I was a kid, when I was in my 20s, my attitude when older people would say something like that, and the attitude of many people in my generation was, okay, fine, we're just going to take over the room, and which is what we would literally do. These days, young people just disappear. They just say, okay, not hasta la vista, but adios, and they're gone. And I think that our movement has to appreciate that and understand that this has to be a multi-generational movement.
Pete, you're next.
All right, thank you. Brother Bill, conversation's right on time as always.
Thank you.
My question falls in line with what we were just speaking about. So how do we go about creating spaces for younger leaders, up and coming people within the movement? How do we begin to create spaces and combat kind of the systemic structures that have been put in place to keep them down, to keep people in their perceived positions of power or authority?
Well, there's a few things that we need to do. So one thing is that we need to have real, honest to goodness leadership development programs. And that's leadership development programs is not about training people how to process grievances. That's important. Processing grievances is very important as part of steward training. But I mean, like, we need to have our up and coming leaders read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, where they actually are looking into and starting to think about strategy and tactics, thinking big scale. And we need to make this interesting. So that's one of the things, Peter, that I think is very important. Our leadership development programs need to really be focused at developing leaders. The second thing is that there need to be things that people can do. And that is not necessarily, or in every case, a job. There's a limited number of jobs that are going to be in the union movement. Our movement is fundamentally based on volunteerism of rank and file workers that are taking time out to do things, knowing that they will not be compensated, but knowing that it's important. And within that, there are a variety of different roles in running committees, doing campaigns, et cetera, where we need to be placing some of our younger activists. A third thing is mentoring. I was very fortunate coming up. At different points, I had mentors. Now, I was the kind of person, because of my personality, that I just sort of seized on certain people. And they became my mentors. Not everybody will do that. Some people are more shy. But we need to have mentorship. Not where you're like telling people what to do, but where you're developing a relationship, a long-term relationship between a veteran activist and someone who's new, about what it means to be a trade union activist, answering questions, et cetera. So all of those things need to happen. And then, of course, there's jobs. And one way to guarantee that someone doesn't succeed is to hire them into a position where their roles and responsibilities are unclear and where they've had no training. And this is one of the things that I've seen all too often. When I started my first staff job in a union, I was responsible for being a lead negotiator of multiple contracts. Had I ever been a lead negotiator? No. Had I been at the negotiating table? Yes, once. Did I get any training? Well, the training was to follow around another staff person through her negotiations. And then before her negotiations were even finished, I was kicked into negotiations. And I'm here to tell you, I still have nightmares about some of those negotiations. I'm amazed that I was able to win on so many negotiations because the mistakes that I made, I mean, it's embarrassing, absolutely embarrassing. But I had no training. And you need to make sure that people have the requisite skills. There's a story that a guy that used to work for me, I used to work for the American Federation of Government Employees. And one of my staff told me a story about the late John Sturtevant, who had been the president of the union in the 90s. And the staff person was hired, and one day there was a knock at his door, and it was John Sturtevant, the president of the union. And he came in, he said, "Can I come in?" And my staff person said, "Of course," right? So Sturtevant came and sat down, and he said to my staff person, he said, "Charlie, do you have everything that you need in order to do your job?" And Charlie said, yeah, I do. And Sturtevant said, "Good, because I have a lot that I'm looking for you to do, and I don't want to later hear from you that you didn't have what you needed in order to succeed." When I heard that story, I said, damn, that's leadership. And I can't think of how many organizations that I've been through and know about where no one has asked the new people anything that approaches that. So I think that all of those, Peter, would be part of my approach.
All right, so we're going to go to King, then Keith, and I also want to please remind people, please make it brief. And also, if anyone is watching on Facebook Live, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the comments. But King, go ahead with your question.
Oh, well, my question, hello, Bill. Good to see you, and a very great conversation we're having. And I loved your lecture.
Thank you very much.
My question is, how do you get the younger people to come to the table and then stay there and participate? We seem to have a generation that expects change like overnight. They want everything to happen instantly. And when that doesn't happen, they want to just give up and walk away. So how do we get them to understand, that some things take time, but get them to stay to help to make things better?
Well, King, that's an interesting question. And in part, I would say that I remember when I was in my teens and 20s, older people saying exactly the same thing about our generation, right? And they'd say, "Oh, these young people, they want everything today." And it's like they don't want to go through all the process, and they want it now, right? And so one thing I would say is that that's partly generational. I think it's true of every young generation. I've read stories about young activists in the 1920s who were having these same kind of battles against their elders, who were saying, "Now wait a minute, you want to move too fast." So one thing I'd say is that's youth. And we've got to accept that, even though it's driving us nuts. And it is, right? I get you, right? The second thing is that one thing that can often be useful is to create spaces that are controlled by young people. I don't mean the kiddie corner, but I mean there are committees that the union sets up that are really run by young, and it doesn't have to be called the young people's thing. It might be the community outreach committee, for example, and it ends up being populated with younger activists. Because what I've found is that younger activists are more likely to stay if they feel like they have a vested interest, and if they feel like they can actually, what they want to do or what they think actually counts. So I think we've got to give people space. The other thing is, it relates to issues of mentorship. One of the things that happened when I was growing up is that, in part because many people of my generation were in effect saying to older people, "Y'all need to get the hell out of the way," right? Many of the older people did, and they vanished. And I'm talking about people that had valuable experience, like from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They basically felt like, well, I'm not needed. And the thing that I found, King, is that I feel that. I mean, I have been through going through different movements where I feel like younger people are basically saying they don't need me around. And it hurts. It hurts like hell, right? It's like when the Black Lives Matter stuff was starting, I contacted some people that I knew who were major leaders in the movement nationally. I said, okay, let's rock and roll. How can I help? Not how can I take over, but how can I help? And the responses I got were, oh, Bill, oh, we really appreciate your interest. Oh, God, you have so much experience. Oh, right? You're a veteran. Oh, we're going to get back to you. Silence. Nothing. And it can make you bitter. And what then I realized is that, okay, all I can do is extend myself. And then what I have to do is figure out where I can add value and go there. And so there's certain places that I've gone, and I want to encourage older people to think about that. Don't, even if you feel like you're being dissed by younger people, don't become bitter. Figure out where you can go in the movement and where you can add value. Go there and make your contributions, but definitely extend yourself to younger people and say, look, I'm here to help. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'll tell you my experiences. And increasingly, King, I have found that I get called upon a lot more. So it can work.
And
Let's say, so basically you're saying give them their own space and let them take charge of it, but be there to mentor them, to help them succeed?
Absolutely. And recruit them into things, definitely. Okay. It's like, but don't give them busy work, right? Because that's the thing that younger people really resent. If they feel like you're chumping them, right? That you're basically just giving them busy work. But it's like, if you are trying to build, like, I was working to build an online magazine for a couple of years. It's called The Global African Worker. And I set out and identified younger activists to be part of and central to the editorial collective. Not to be carrying my water, but to be part of co-leading this thing. And that means a lot to folks. And then it ends up being a question of, well, are they going to stick with it or are they not? And some people are going to flake out. But that's true about older people too.
Thank you.
And you got a lot of comments, both on Facebook and in here. Dave said, call it next generation helping this generation now. They might feel empowered. Helen Hudson says they say it now. Rick said, been there, felt that. And then over on Facebook Live, Ray Trudell says, sometimes taking over everything is what too many union leaders do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Control freaks. We have a lot of control freaks in our movement. In fact, there's one particular leader who's now deceased that I was thinking about, who was a brilliant leader, but was a total control freak, and to the detriment of his union. And we see that a lot, this sort of fear in leaders of giving up some control and recognizing, and it's like, and I get it on one level, you know that you can do the work, but you can't build organization if you think you're the source of all light and all wisdom. It won't happen. And so you've got to be willing to share, to build a collective leadership. And it's really hard because people's egos can be very fragile.
Okay, Keith, you want to make another comment? Go ahead, and please be brief.
Yeah, I'll be brief, I promise. I would have to agree with you, touching bases with the younger generation and the older generation. There has to be a real fine line between that. And also, I just want to ask you a question about how do you feel about instituting changing bylaws through the resolutions at conferences for term limits to institute needed change? What's your thoughts on that?
I am very, 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 did I say very, in favor of term limits. And in case you weren't clear on that, I am very in favor of term limits. We have leaders in our movement who have to be carried out of office. There was a leader of one particular union, and when I was in AFL-CIO, I was a top staff person. I would go to executive council meetings, so I'd see some of these characters up close. And there were some leaders, and I was looking at some of these characters, and I'm saying, you got out of bed and came to a meeting looking like that? And you have nothing to say in these meetings? And you're falling asleep? I mean, my God, right? We're in a war, and so yes, Keith, we need term limits, but they don't need to be ridiculous term limits, by which I mean, I think that the idea should be that leaders should have like a maximum of maybe 10 years in office and then have to leave. And maybe they can come back after a break. But it's really important that you offer opportunities for new people. And one of the things that happens when you don't have term limits is that you start to develop cults of personality around leaders. And what ends up happening is that the incumbent can no longer be questioned because they become like a demigod. And so you start raising questions and people say, how dare you challenge the Almighty, right? And then the leader starts to believe their own publicity, and things ossify. You need to basically have a point where you can say, thank you very much for your service. We really appreciate everything that you've done. And now it's time for someone new who may do things differently than you did. And that's okay, because that's how organizations grow.
And we're going to have that be the last comment. Before you go, Bill, Patton is also one of my favorite movies. And actually, in cinema history, Francis Ford Coppola wrote the screenplay and used the money from that to fund The Godfather. So there's a lot of lines there. But my favorite line from that movie is at the very end, when he's walking away with his dog Willie, and he's talking about the Roman tribute. So whenever I get a big head or anything like that, I remember him describing and the saying, "All glory is fleeting." So
absolutely. And Mark, if I can say one final thing.
Sure.
Since you brought up Coppola, I have to say this, because it relates to leadership. There's a scene in The Godfather where Michael Corleone is saying to Tom Hagen, played by Robert Duvall. Robert Duvall is, they're having a discussion because Michael has picked another consigliere. And Hagen is very upset because he's been a consigliere to the Corleone family. And Michael says, Tom, there are wartime consiglieres and there are peacetime consiglieres. You're not a wartime consigliere. We're in a moment where we need wartime consiglieres. And that's what we need to think about when we're looking about the kind of leadership that we need to be bringing into our movement. Thank you very much, folks.
Amen. And I'm grateful to everybody here. Again, I'm grateful to Amory Talercio from the Central New York Area Labor Federation for being here. Peter DeJesus from the Western New York Area Labor Federation. Again, the Mid-State Central Labor Council for canceling their meeting for this. And the Central New York Chapter, CBTU. Again, Bill Fletcher, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your wisdom, your brain is just like, I just love your brain. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank
Take
you
care.
all. Brothers and sisters, have a good night. Labor Council
Thank
meeting
you.
tomorrow night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night now.